Welcome to everyone who's here already to Change for Good. It's April 30th, hard to believe that. It's 11 o'clock here in Toronto. And this is Change for Good. And I can't remember, this is probably a sign of where we are, because I was actually, before we started today, I was trying to remember if this is the 7th or 8th week working at home. I think it's the 8th week for most of us. But we've been doing these this is the 5th episode of Change for Good, and it's in the context of COVID obviously being a crisis, but also I think an opportunity for positive change, and that's what Change for Good is all about. And today I have the real great pleasure of speaking with Tabatha Bull, who's the President and CEO of the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. Which is a remarkable organization that has a mission of fostering sustainable business relations between First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and Canadian business. Welcome, Tabatha.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Paul, and to Impact and all the viewers. As we talked a little bit, this is a really important discussion, and one of the possible silver linings from COVID-19 is that there's more questions being asked about Aboriginal business and the impact and what we can be doing as Canadians and as corporations to help ensure that they're successful and continue to prosper beyond COVID. So I'm really happy to have this conversation. So thanks again for having me.
No, it's such a pleasure. And I was saying, we've never met in person, but like many other things today, we're meeting this way, which is still great. So, Tabatha, we're really looking forward, I know everyone is looking forward to hearing from you about what CCAB is doing to help address the needs of Aboriginal businesses today, and also about the whole area of economic reconciliation, which you and I spoke about earlier in the week. It's an area that I don't think enough people are familiar with, and what that means today, and also what it means for your members and the world of business in Canada as the economy recovers. Now, also, just wanted to remind everybody that we look forward to your questions as well. So while Tabatha and I are talking, if you think of any questions, please share them, and we'll just try and address them as we go. So as I said, I couldn't remember how long we've been working at home. This is the 7th or 8th week. Everyone's going through, changing how they do things, But Tabatha, for people like you who lead organizations, I think it's particularly different, and you're not only responsible for your changes in your own life, but leading a team and leading an organization that's very important. So what does that look like for you, and how has leadership of CCAB changed? What are you doing differently?
So I became President CEO about on a Friday, and the Monday we started working remotely as an organization. So there's been a lot of changes for our team, for sure. Luckily I had been at the organization prior to that, so I knew the team, and I can't imagine had we brought someone in new that didn't know the team, and then we all started working remotely. So we immediately went to work from home and adapted really quickly, and the team has been incredible through this whole process. And we've been very busy. Initially I thought, okay, well, we're not going to be traveling. We can start to look really internally at our processes, but it's become very evident that a big part of our role as CCAB is to ensure that we're helping Aboriginal businesses through this process and helping corporate Canada as well. But we've been doing a lot of work just trying to be the voice for Aboriginal business through all of the government programs, and ensuring that all of those programs are looking at eligibility across the nation and for Indigenous businesses as well. And then also ensuring that we're bringing those businesses and suppliers of PPE that are Indigenous, or we have a lot of members, I think we can chat a little bit later, that have been so innovative at pivoting the work that they're doing, trying to make sure that we're getting those businesses on the radar of federal government when they're trying to get to this supply. I think, when I moved into the nonprofit sector close to 2 years ago, it really struck me how it's so easy in this sector for people to get burnt out, because they are so determined and committed to the work that they're doing. So that's really been on my radar with our team, working from home and the stress of COVID, and then also trying to do everything we can for businesses can really amp the stress level. So trying to be really cognizant of that for our team and stay connected has been really important.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. I want to get into, of course, more detail about the specific situation with Aboriginal businesses and economic reconciliation and these other things are so important. But I also wanted to, I was also thinking about, I think during all these conversations that we've had and beyond just this, I think there's in general, I think there's clearly, we're in a situation where people who are already vulnerable are even more vulnerable today. And I thought if you could also just share anything that you're hearing about the situation for Aboriginal people and communities in Canada today, and how is that changing? What are you hearing?
Yeah, it is definitely true. Vulnerable communities, when in situations such as this, are even more vulnerable. And for Indigenous communities that lack clean drinking water or clean water have been on boil water advisories for up to 20 years, some of them. So even from the initial part where everybody was wash your hands, I mean, that's difficult in a daily situation for a number of Indigenous peoples. And the overcrowding issues in homes, of course, puts them at a much bigger risk as well, just when everybody's trying to work from home or everybody's having to stay home. That has been, even more difficult for those communities. And then just access to, food. And, there's a community, I was reading their newspaper, and unfortunately they now have 6 confirmed cases. They're a community that's on diesel, but they have a solar panel project right now at Gull Bay First Nation. They're north of Thunder Bay. And in their newsletter, they showed pictures of getting the order from Staples, from Thunder Bay, of the work packages, the work home packages for their kids and students. And it just really struck me that extra measure that community has to go to just to be able to go to work from home or school from home for their students. Just, every change that we're doing, and we're so privileged to have online learning for our kids here in the city. Every measure that's being taken to prevent COVID into a community is just that much more difficult. And the real concern about the loss of our elders, who are knowledge keepers and who are so important to our communities when COVID is so much more dangerous for our elderly people, is definitely a real concern in community. And I completely understand the strict measures they're taking to close their borders and ensure that they can keep their people safe.
A difficult situation for those communities, even more so today. And one of the things that, if we have time, or maybe you can share afterwards, if there's anything that people listening might do or help, any ways that people could help, I'm sure people would love to know that as well. There's some specific things that people might be able to do. Now, turning to economic reconciliation, which is a term that I actually hadn't been familiar with until we spoke earlier this week. And it's something that's obviously a priority for you at CCAB and for the entire Aboriginal business community. Just first of all, you could just share what that means. What is economic reconciliation? What do we need to know about that?
So economic reconciliation is a term that CCAB and our predecessor, JP Gladue, used quite a bit. And he often used to say, and still says, that economic reconciliation is when communities are managing wealth and not poverty. And for so many years, hundreds of years, we've been managing poverty, and we need to move beyond that. And a large part of economic reconciliation is Indigenous business. And if you look at not just Indigenous business within a community and what they're doing, but if corporate Canada and the federal government can also support Indigenous business, just from purchasing from Indigenous business or including them in their supply chain, the impact that we see on those communities that those businesses come from, or potentially those communities own, is staggering. And I often like to say, it's not about spending extra money. It's not about increased tax dollars or an increased budget line for a corporation. It's about using the money you're already spending, but ensuring that you're directing a portion of that to an Indigenous supply chain. And the benefit that can have, both from a social impact perspective, just in their social economic unemployment and benefits to the community, are substantial. I know we talk often about Suncor. They were one of our initial procurement, they were the co-chair of our procurement champion, but Mark Little, who now is the CEO, often says, that money he knows is going towards a new elder care facility or an upgrade to the water treatment plant. When Suncor is spending money in Indigenous businesses in their area, they know that how far that money goes is much further.
Mm-hmm. Now, Aboriginal businesses, I feel like, correct if I'm wrong, but at least it feels like the Aboriginal business community was kind of on a roll, right? And things like these great examples you described with Suncor and other things. Now we've got COVID that's come in and is putting a huge amount of pressure on every business. And I think there's some unique pressures on Aboriginal businesses in this context of what is that situation like? How are things different for Aboriginal businesses today in the context of COVID and the economic reconciliation you just described?
One of the biggest barrier for Indigenous business is access to financing and capital. And when we're in a point right now where liquidity and access to capital is the biggest concern for all businesses across the country, that does put Indigenous business at a increased risk. So, the announcements that have come out of the government have been helpful. The Canadian Emergency Business Account, very helpful. But when that first came out, we really had to stand up and loudly together as Indigenous economic organizations remind the government that Indigenous businesses don't typically access financing from traditional lending institutions. And that's because, with the Indian Act, they don't own the land. So it's very difficult for a business to have any type of collateral, and their risk is much higher in going to access financing. Mm-hmm. So happy to know that the government did announce an additional $306 million that will be funded to Indigenous businesses through the Aboriginal financial institutions and NACA, but that's still only about 6,000 businesses. So we're still actively looking at other ways that we can get financing to Indigenous business. That's definitely been a huge barrier. And, we talked about this a little bit, but the government has been, I have to say, they're moving very fast, really, when you think it's been 7 weeks that we've been in this process. But there's often times where there's little things that are not intentional but have excluded Indigenous business. So we need to ensure that we're looking at those things from the very beginning and not having to dig further to say, are businesses excluded for this? And the wage subsidy is another example. Aboriginal economic development corporations are large businesses that have a First Nation community as a shareholder, but they do so much to bring communities programming and to ensure that the revenue and profit that comes out of those economic development corporations goes back to support the community. Originally, they were excluded from the wage subsidy because they have that government part as a shareholder. And we had lots of discussions, lots of economic development corporations had discussions with government, and that has now changed also. But it's just taking that extra amount of time to ensure that we're including Indigenous businesses and that they can continue the momentum. So, as you said, Indigenous businesses are doing so well. There's over 50,000 Indigenous business in Canada. And Indigenous businesses are being created at 9 times the rate of non. And we need to somehow ensure that we're continuing that momentum, and that in the recovery period, we're also ensuring that there's momentum there. So, yeah, I know that was a very long-winded answer, but definitely being impacted. We're definitely having to continue to look into those programs and making sure that our businesses are able to access them, and government has been responsive, which is helpful. And we have seen some incredible businesses being able to pivot and innovate. So Raven Brewery is a certified Aboriginal business in BC, and they have pivoted to start to develop hand sanitizer, which is incredible work. And Abraflex, which is an Indigenous owned business that normally supplies clothing or protective equipment to the nuclear industry, has now pivoted, and they're now doing medical gowns. So we've seen such innovation from Indigenous business in order to step up and help Canada combat COVID.
Well, also that'd be great. We would be happy to share these afterwards, businesses, and as a follow up to this, people should know about this. Is fantastic. The other thing that occurs to me, you've got kind of a sort of a double whammy in a way, because I know there's a lot of Aboriginal businesses who are, you mentioned the supply chain, got the oil and gas industry has been hit particularly hard. That must be having an impact on supply chains in whichever Aboriginal business, you've got fisheries and so on. What are the areas that you've seen, any other examples of the industry where, and you've got, I don't know how many members, many members across the country, where are you seeing the areas of opportunity, in addition to pivoting? As you're looking forward, like where are you seeing areas of most opportunity for Aboriginal businesses in Canada, and how they work with other businesses as well is so important.
So I think for those businesses who are able to provide PPE or are in the health sector already, but also for businesses that are able to pivot, there's an opportunity with the federal government's purchasing right now under COVID-19, but also an opportunity for all corporations who are needing to purchase PPE or hand sanitizer to look to Indigenous businesses as their supplier. So we have one business called Niche Branding who normally provides pens and like corporate collateral. They've now pivoted to hand sanitizer, and they're supplying to BMO and Hydro One here in Ontario. So there's an opportunity there's many businesses who have the ability to pivot, who are already supplying that in the Indigenous economy. And there's an opportunity for corporate Canada to even now ensure that they're including those businesses in their supply chain. I think out of this, there are a number of, we've seen a lot of increase in Indigenous businesses in IT, in app development and IT support. And I think there's going to be, a real opportunity for those businesses as well, as we're all moving to a more virtual workspace, but, and not knowing how much we're going to go back to the old normal of everybody going to the office, right? And everybody doing training in person. I think there's going to be a real opportunity for this new normal that we find from a virtual perspective. And
Great, thank you. We've got a bunch of questions here. Maybe Ken has a question here for you. What is your perspective, thoughts, or knowledge regarding the Aboriginal Indigenous Opportunities Corporation? Something I'm not familiar with, but if you're aware of that, or
I'm not aware of that either.
Okay, we'll go on. Another question is George has said, what is your experience with ISC? ISC.
So ISC is Indigenous Services Canada. So they used it used to be one federal ministry, but it was divided into Indigenous Service Canada, and which basically works with the programming. They've been actually great to work with. We are probably, so with ISC staff, we're on the phone with them weekly. And Pam DeMoff, who's the Parliamentary Secretary for Indigenous Service Canada, has also been actively reaching out to understand what the impact is and how much what they can do to help from an Indigenous business perspective. I think everything I've seen on ISC is what we familiarly call them, has been doing to get PPE to communities has also been, I think, better than what we've seen in the past. And they've been great partners for sure.
Thank you. Another question, really important, kind of relates to what you were saying before. So for other businesses who might want to access Aboriginal businesses within their own supply chain, is there a mechanism of how do people find out about Aboriginal suppliers? How would you best connect to that?
So we have we have a program called Supply Change, which includes an Aboriginal procurement marketplace.
Okay.
And in that marketplace, we have about 500 certified Aboriginal businesses that have updated profiles and continue to update what they can supply. And then we have over 60 procurement champions, which would be corporations who are committed to buying from Indigenous businesses in that same marketplace. So that's one way through CCAB, and I'm happy to connect with anybody who's interested in that.
Okay.
You can also go to our website and find an open list of members of Aboriginal businesses as well.
Okay, thank you. There's so many questions here. So Dan has asked regarding, you mentioned bank financing or lack of access to capital, and Aboriginal people not owning land. I guess his question is this for treaty Indians? If so, how does this affect the Aboriginal groups in BC not under treaty? A very specific question related to BC. If you're familiar with the situation there.
It's more the Indian Act that, so all the First Nation reserve land is still owned by the federal government, not by the First Nation. And my understanding is that would be the same in BC as well. The treaty is a little bit different because it goes beyond your reserve land, and that allows more for you to have rights over the impact of that land, treaty rights around hunting and fishing and resources. But the First Nation land is not owned by the First Nation or by anyone who lives on that land. So my parents live on Nipissing First Nation. They have a beautiful home there, but they don't own the land that house is on. So if they were to sell that home, they're selling really just the home, and depending on the community, only a First Nation member would be able to purchase it. So in going to a bank for a mortgage, as an example, to build a home, you don't own that land. So it's very difficult for any type of lending. Now, a lot of financial institutions have developed new programs to be able to reduce that risk. And it is definitely improving. We have a number of, all of the major banks are members of CCAB, and they're doing really great work to work with businesses on reserve and to look at the guarantees that they can provide. And to reduce the risk rating, but it still is a barrier for a number of small businesses.
And just another question, not for me. Again, related to your, the mission as we understand it of CCAB is fostering sustainable business relations between the Aboriginal and Indigenous businesses and other Canadian businesses. So and you mentioned the supply chain. Well, what else if someone's in a Canadian business, can a Canadian business be doing to be more inclusive of Aboriginal businesses, people, and culture, and so on? Where do we need to go? Where do we need to take it from here?
So I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had a specific recommendation around reconciliation with Indigenous people for corporate Canada. And part of that is about cultural awareness. A lot of people who are in the working world or who are, our kids today are learning about reconciliation and learning about residential schools, but there's a lot of adults in Canada who are not aware of the history of our country and Indigenous people, and frankly not aware about why there may be a need for additional funding to Indigenous people. I did a short interview on CBC after they announced the $306 million funding, and I will warn anyone not to read the comments that people posted on that story. There is still a significant amount of people in this country who do not understand why there may be additional barriers and do not believe that there should be any additional consideration for Indigenous business or people. So I think really just educating staff. There's so many cultural awareness trainers out there and businesses out there that can help provide understanding for your staff. We have a program, this isn't supposed to be a commercial for CCAB, but we have a program called Progressive Aboriginal Relations, which is a certification program that non-Indigenous and Indigenous businesses undertake. And it looks at 4 pillars. So one is employment. What are you doing to not just employ Indigenous people, but also ensure that they have an ability to move up through your organization? The other is business development, which really looks at procurement. The other is community relations. So that would be, how are you related to the communities that you're impacting? So neighboring you, but how are you working with just Indigenous community in general? So maybe that's scholarship programs or supporting functions, or maybe it's really about how am I engaging with the communities that are around us, and then leadership actions. And that's something that, we're seeing great things from a number of businesses, just really going above and beyond with Indigenous communities. The thing about that program is it's intent-based. So you look at a list of questions and criteria, and then say, as a business, what impact can I really have here? And you choose what programs you think you can able to do within all of those pillars, and then go through a process. And then we have independent verifiers that go out to your business and will interview Indigenous employees and interview the communities. And it's a certification process in the end, and there's 3 different levels. So before I came to CCAB, I managed a First Nation Métis relations team, did a lot of engagement. And for a lot of people who are doing that within their corporation, it's a very small team and a very large business. So PAR really helps because it's an executive-led structure, and you have to get buy-in across the whole business, which makes a big difference.
Thank you for sharing. There's so many, we need to get all these out to people, to find a way of just having links and sharing this with everyone. There's another great question here from Eliza, which is something that we haven't talked about. Her question is around the differences between rural versus urban Aboriginal communities. And she's asking, has been significant differences in the management of wealth in urban versus rural context? I know there's a huge difference culturally and business-wise and so on. Your thoughts on that?
I think partially there's a difference in programming. Not for Indigenous business. I mean, a number of our members are urban businesses. But even now you see a lot of a call for programming for urban Indigenous people. And how are we helping to support them through all the work that we're doing. But there are a number of urban reserves just starting now, which, there's a couple in Saskatoon, which I think is an amazing new way that we're moving towards, ensuring that those people who are displaced from their community or who've had to leave their community to be part of the economic engine of Canada, which really is unfortunately how things have moved, that they have a place for community within a city, and they have a place for Indigenous business to prosper in that city as well. So I think that has been really important. And then I think for youth too, it's very important for us to be able to have places to support Indigenous youth that are in urban centers for schooling. So supports to ensure that we're able to support Indigenous youth in urban centers is very important. And there are some supports there, but I don't think it's something that we're thinking about enough.
Another question that comes to mind for me, we chatted about this a little bit earlier, is I think it's clear to a lot of people that, one of the reasons we're in the situation we're in today with COVID is fundamentally unsustainable business practice. And, there's a degree of irresponsibility in the way business works, and also on the consumer side as well. And it strikes me that within the Aboriginal Indigenous world, business people and businesses have had a sense of sustainability that I think we can learn a lot from. So what can we learn from Aboriginal businesses today that we can incorporate into the way we do what we do and how we work and so on? Seems like it's a very timely thing to look back on.
Yeah, we've had this discussion actually with a couple of our members. We were talking about Cheekbone Beauty, so Jen Harper, who I believe you're going to have in an upcoming
Yes, we are.
talk, which is incredible. She owns a cosmetics company, and she's just recently launched a fully sustainable lipsticks and lip gloss. And she often says that the cosmetic industry is really moving towards this sustainable way of life, and she'll often say that's how we've been living all our lives, Indigenous people. And a number of organizations are starting to adopt those sustainable goals and thinking, in Indigenous culture, many Indigenous cultures think 7 generations ahead. So for everything I'm doing and whatever I'm taking from the land, how is this going to impact my 7th generation? And that's not how most of corporate Canada thinks. And we really need to think about about that. And I think part of that is about slowing down what we're doing and really having the discussions and the patience to think about the impact and assess the impact before we move forward. I think the other thing that we really see, and this is, I did a talk about on Walrus Talk on consumerism, and initially I was kind of like, I don't know how this relates to what we're working on, but if we think about the power that we have in our wallet and where we're spending our dollars, if we look at a number of Indigenous businesses, they are sustainable, and they are also ensuring that they're giving back to community or to culture or to youth. So we have so many examples of incredible Indigenous businesses that are, so Cheekbone Beauty is an example, with 10% of their profits go towards Indigenous youth education. Birch Bark Coffee is another great example of a business that Indigenous owned coffee business, and for every 50 bags they sell, they purchase a water purification system for a home on a First Nation. So just really looking for those businesses that are already putting into practice sustainable practices, but also ensuring that they're also providing something back to their community or to the world for the business that they do. And that's not just Indigenous business. There are a number of businesses that do that, but we need to think about, where am I spending my money as individuals as well? And what good is it doing beyond what I'm purchasing from them? Now that we're at home as well, what are we doing? Like, we're supporting local and ensuring that we're supporting those local businesses so that they can survive. And that's really important and something that every one of us can do.
Tabatha, first of all, I feel like we could talk all day long. I've learned so much from you, and I think everyone here is, the benefit of what you've shared, and we will be sure to get the specifics out to everyone today. Mm-hmm. But I first of all just want to thank you so much for taking the time to share this, to share what CCAB is doing, what economic reconciliation means. Some of these specific examples are very inspiring, and I think just as the last thing you said, I think, is so important, and just leaves us with a sort of a beautiful way to think differently about how business should operate today and how we should think differently as consumers. So thank you, and the team at CCAB, and incredible work. It's just been such a pleasure. We'll meet in person sometime. I also wanted to thank our team at Impact, who continue to be, as I always say, 100% dedicated to helping organizations solve social problems, more important than ever. Thank everyone here, and also very excited to say that next week at this time at 11 o'clock, I have the great pleasure of speaking with Andrea Barrick, who's head of sustainability and citizenship globally for TD Bank. And you can register for that session with Andrea on the impactcorp.com website. I think you can do that today. So we really appreciate everyone's consideration and participation today. Everyone will get a copy of our conversation that we've had here today. You'll be sent that tomorrow. We look forward to welcoming you to more Change for Good conversations, and I hope everybody stays safe. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.